Welcome. Am I on?
Yes.
Welcome to the final Q&A of the day and of the conference. I'd like to first open again by congratulating you all for being here all week. And it's been quite a week, and we're going to try and get to as many of your questions as possible in the time that's given to us. And the first question actually goes to Mr. Griffin. It says, in a courtroom, a collective group of individuals votes to find an individual innocent or guilty. Is this an example of collectivism?
Short answer is no. Collectivism is defined by most of those things I was discussing earlier, but in the case we're talking about, coercion is the active ingredient in this case, because no one is coercing the jury to vote in a certain way. There's a difference between collective action and collectivism. Just because I'm an individualist doesn't mean that I have to move my piano alone, you know? And the essence is that individualists often work together collectively, but it's a voluntary situation. And that applies to this courtroom example where we're asking for the individual judgment of 12 people, let's say that's the number, and there's no coercion, or if there is coercion, then the law has been violated and the whole principle has been subverted. So the answer is no.
Here's a question for Brian McCall. You had said earlier in your talk that the practice of the church recently regarding usury is not to issue statements about it, but to leave it up to the priest in the confessional to deal with individual cases. The question is, it's a twofold question. Number one, are priests today taught about usury according to the traditional teaching of the church? And secondly, what textbook, if they're not, what textbook could be used to teach them?
Well, a couple of things. First, it's not that the church over the last several hundred years didn't issue statements about usury. They did, to, again, restate the principles and to teach the principles. The difference was there was a time when there was simpler economics where they could issue more detailed rulings on whether something did or didn't constitute usury. Again, because of the intentional deception that's being created by our financial system, in the 19th century, that's when the Vatican became more reserved and said, well, the facts are a little more complicated, and again, we don't want people developing scrupulosity and thinking they're doing something wrong when they're not. And rather than a centralized decision-making on those cases, they transferred some of the jurisdiction, in a sense, back to the priests on the ground. Now, what I didn't say, and what I hope you didn't understand, is that what then happened in the 20th century was wrong. So that, I think, was a prudential decision, which was good. What happened in the 20th century is what happened with so many moral issues, is the church stopped talking about the principles and just remained silent. And again, that was the debacle over artificial contraception in the 60s. You know, they stopped talking about it. Fortunately, thank God, Pope Paul VI came out and ended that a little bit. But that's not what I'm saying was good. So that they've just virtually dropped it. Benedict XVI, John Paul II, once or twice referred to it. That is a silence, a culpable silence of not telling people about the truth, distinguished from the prudential judgment of, as to individual people and what they're doing, to entrust those decisions to apply the principles. And so that's, again, an important distinction. As to, now, we are facing a problem, again, is across the moral spectrum, that priests and faithful are facing, is that the seminaries abdicated their duty to properly, in general, teach priests how to advise on moral issues, and it deals with usury, with economic issues, and others all across the board. And yes, for a long time, seminaries were not teaching detailed moral philosophy. You know, they were, John, you're famous for, saying, they just said, oh, just be nice. That's all you need to know. Tell people if they're nice, they're okay. And so, yes, that was not going on. And so, yes, there are priests who are struggling in the confession, who want to give spiritual direction but haven't been trained. To your answer, yes, there were manuals of moral philosophy that presented the principles, presented illustrations of the cases, but they're all thrown out of the seminaries. And this problem is not from the 60s and 70s. It goes back decades to not train priests. Archbishop Lefebvre, in his biography, Bishop Tissier talks about he in the 1920s, Archbishop Lefebvre, in Rome, struggled to find a good seminary teacher and foundation. And they had to be careful in the 1920s who was teaching. There were those who were not teaching the full truth. And so the problem is not a recent one. It was a long time coming, because what does the devil know? He knows the priests are the key. And if they're not trained properly, they're not going to pass on. And Archbishop Lefebvre's, what he wanted on his tombstone was, I have handed on what I received. And the devil knows if you undermine by not giving the priest what to hand on, they've received nothing, they can't give it on. And so, yes, it's a serious problem, but there are old theological, moral philosophy texts from the seminaries that were used for a long time that are out there that could be reprinted and are being used in a few seminaries that do train their priests.
I'll follow up with you, Dr. McCall. You yourself have written a book on this topic. Would that be suitable for university, or I won't say suitable, but did you have it in mind for university or seminary use?
Well, I tried to write the book so that it's documented, but I also tried to write it so it was understandable to a wider audience. So it's not just directed towards graduate students or in universities. It certainly could be used as a text there. I'm going to use it. I'm teaching a seminar at Notre Dame University in the spring where I'll use it as a text to be studied. But it's written to be more accessible than that. For a seminary, I mean, it certainly is written to get the general principles out. I think in a seminary, though, a priest in training would need more than that because he needs some more detailed guidance. But in terms of at least getting the principle on the table, it certainly could do that.
I would just add to that one of the things that's needed in the seminaries is, Dr. McCall alluded to it, was a return to a very structured format of teaching ethics and moral theology. Because I understand that today in many seminaries, they'll just be giving textbooks, problems in medicine, problems in economics. You've probably seen them.
Yes.
Problems in pro-life issues. And oftentimes they're not even structured principles of how to think, but they are simply essays, 2 in favor of capital punishment, 2 against, 2 in favor of abortion, 2 against, and you have to wade your way through this. But the standard Thomistic moral theology would teach you the first principles of regarding right and wrong, then principles regarding how man ought to act. Dr. Waters used to say that we have to learn the oughty so we don't be naughty. And man, and then from there you move into the conjugal society, which is husband and wife. From there you move to the domestic society, which this is how it would be structured, how it used to be structured, the domestic society of family life. And then only then do you move into society and social ethics and social principles, and then you get into the business of taxation and all these other things. So what we need, as I think Dr. McCall was referring to, is a return to a complete system of moral theology based on St. Thomas, and of course, Father Gruner would say, especially St. Alphonse Liguori.
And Father Fahey, for that matter. Father Fahey is the whole, you can't have morals without dogma. All morals is, the moral law is do good and avoid evil. But if we don't know what the truth is, we can't do good, we can't avoid evil. So we need, first of all, the dogmatic formation and the church's social teaching. And you have, for example, with Father Fahey, in his 6 points or 7 points, however you want to count them, that there's a structure to society, that society exists for the honor and glory of God and for us to save our souls. And that's the high, and in order to do that, we need the church to give the sacraments and, of course, to administer them properly and so forth. You get down from there to the marriage is between one man and one woman, and it's for life. and it's for the duration of the lives of both the partners, spouses, and that they should accept all the children that God wishes to send them, and then the structure of that is that the man as a worker or producer is to earn enough to be able to support his family in order to educate them, in order to bring them to God. And now you have the plan of Christ, and it's all outlined in Father Fahey's many of his books, but we have one of them there, if they still have some copies of the Fatima Against, or Fatima and the Great Conspiracy. The other side of that is the devil's plan, in which, and money is supposed to serve God, serve man, in order to help production, in order to pay people's wages, in order to be able to parents to educate their children and to feed them and to bring them to God. But the devil's plan is that the banking system is at the service of the devil, and that production serves banking, and the families serve production, and that education serves production and banking and so forth, and it's a complete inversion of that. And it's brilliant writing from Father Fahey, which he quotes both from the papal scriptures, papal teaching on the magisterium, including banking, including usury and so forth, and then he gives you the reverse that the devil gives you from Masonic documents, from communist documents, and other anti-God. And the big divide really is whether we're for God or against God. And yes, I agree fully, we should not be praying for God's reign and the next moment voting for the devil's reign. And so we have to be informed. And so that's why I do want to hear more about the fractional reserve banking system, because it is the control of all the other devil's things that go on in the world. And I think that it took me, I must say, 3 weeks to get it when I was in economic school, and it's a very simple concept. Some of the simpler concepts are hard to get. But I think the people, once they understand that, they'll understand a lot of other things going on in the world. But it's certainly, they need that dogmatic background, not just the moral background, do this and don't do that. We do need that. And then when it gets, the morals gets down to the specifics, you need that. But before that, you even need the background. And that's why I think that the church, as long as it doesn't explain the social doctrine of the church, including on banking, they will never get it right. And that has to be done publicly. But I must say, Pius XI said in 1930, in Quadragesimo Anno, the 40th anniversary of the Pope Leo XIII's encyclical, he said that here's a pope who wrote against Hitler, who wrote against Mussolini. He had it written in Italian and smuggled back into Italy to speak against him. He had a lot of courage. But when it came to the international bankers, he said, one hardly dare speak against him. And that was in 1930. And speaking for himself, he hardly did. But that's why Our Lady says to us, only I can help you. That's why she says, you must have, the only way to get out of this is the consecration of Russia. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
Father Gruner, in regards to the statement, in Portugal, the dogma of faith will always be preserved. Is this true? Has the dogma been preserved? And what is the evidence that this is the case? Have the novelties of Vatican II spread to Portugal?
Up until recently, maybe a couple of years ago, maybe more recently still, I tended to think of the church in some ways as the Pope and the bishops and the priests, and of course the lay people. But there's no guarantee that the Pope, that the bishops of Fatima, I'm not saying or Portugal will preserve the faith. I think that the errors that you find in the clergy in other parts of the world will also be found in Portugal. At least that's been my experience, my limited experience. But I think that Our Lady promises that Portugal will preserve the faith. That is, the faithful in Portugal will preserve the faith. And I think that's for two reasons. One is because although the people of Portugal often do not understand the full import of the Fatima message because it's been hidden from them like everybody else, they do understand, as most people hear, and most people have heard, Our Lady asks for the Rosary daily. The Portuguese people take that seriously. 1/6 of the nation goes on pilgrimage every year, a lot of them on foot, to Portugal to honor Our Lady. And I think that those responses in grace at the individual level, at the social level of the parish, going either as a group or individually to honor Our Lady, is a way that Our Lady will give them that grace to preserve them individually and as a group, because the nation does it together. And now there are certainly people in Portugal that don't honor Our Lady and who don't go on pilgrimage, but the nation as a group will preserve the dogma because she promised it, and I think that's why. But it's not necessarily because they have a more stellar clergy than anybody else.
This next question goes to William Jasper, has to do with Hungary. With the situation currently in Hungary, that is Christianity revived and paying off its debt to the International Monetary Fund and kicking out the International Monetary Fund, what's your opinion as to the repercussions of this move and how it will affect the New World Order?
Well, I can't address a great deal of specifics about Hungary's case in this particular instance, but it's very clear for the last several years that the International Monetary Fund has been aiming to, in fact, I've written a number of articles on it called supersizing the IMF. And in fact, they use that term. I picked up on it from their use of that McDonald's term of supersize me. The IMF wants to become, and Christine Lagarde, who is the current head of the International Monetary Fund, is pushing for this, for the International Monetary Fund to become the Federal Reserve of the world, to where they can do all of the same kinds of tricks that the Federal Reserve does with regard to bonds and printing their own currency. They want to have an international currency. They have already initiated that effort, going clear back to Bretton Woods, to when the IMF was founded. You may recall that John Maynard Keynes, the Fabian socialist who was one of the main designers of the IMF, was one of the key men there. He came up with a plan called Bancor back then, which was going to be the international currency. And they're talking about that now again, 60 years later, of instituting this global money through the IMF. The other key man I talked about in my talk today was Harry Dexter White. He was the man in charge of that conference. He was a Soviet agent. And so now here we see all these 60 years later, they are actually moving ahead very forcefully on this. Just in the last couple of weeks, the IMF had another big meeting, and Christine Lagarde, and she's not speaking for herself, of course. She is the spokesman right now for the international bankers. They had the big annual meeting in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, that they have every August. And she again is pushing for giving the IMF these global Federal Reserve powers. And so if they are successful in doing this, then it won't matter how responsible or how moral the individual countries may be or try to be in having a sound economic system. The smaller countries particularly will be completely at the mercy, the merciless mercy of these folks. Even the United States, where we have the Federal Reserve and all the main banks playing such a large role, are going to be part of this whole system, the International Monetary Fund umbrella covering all of this. And the big bank at the top that really coordinates it is the Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland, in Basel, Switzerland. And all of those guys were there this last month in at the Jackson Hole, Wyoming program. So all of this is moving along, and we're trying to keep track of a lot of this. I was very glad to see Ed here today, because Ed has been writing about this for many years, and Dr. Ron Paul, of course, has been the key man in Congress trying to shed light on this, on all of these secretive dealings that are taking place, that are really instituting global theft on a scale never before in the history of the world seen, other than in those cases where emperors came in with whole armies and just simply took everything and took it back to their kingdoms. They do it now digitally with computers. And so if we don't expose the darkness in the banking circles like that, that conquest will be accomplished without a shot being fired.
Perhaps you could just explain how.
Well, yeah, Father was asking me, don't you think it's a good idea to at least briefly explain how they do this digitally? And I agree, it's hard to summarize it simply, but it can be done if you understand the principle first. If you understand the principle, then you don't get buried among all the technical jargon and all of the mechanics. The principle is called theft, okay? Okay, once you get that in your mind, you stop asking the question, well, why did they do that? That doesn't make sense. That's the biggest problem people have. That doesn't make sense, because they're trying to think that these people are honest and they're trying to do what's right, and that's not the case. They're crooks. And so once you get that clearly in mind, then you understand that what they do is they just, legally, they're given the power to create money. To create money that's not backed by anything, which means that there's an endless amount of it they can create. In the old days, when money was backed by gold or silver, it was a terrible arrangement for bankers because there was only so much of it in existence. And you must realize that banks make money by lending money. So if the inventory is limited, they can't lend except what they have. And therefore, their profits are limited by what they have in the vault. So they prefer an arrangement whereby they can create what they lend. You know, you don't have to charge an awful lot of interest on nothing to make a profit. So that's the trick right there. And so the whole scheme that we're talking about is this mumbo jumbo to legalize the process by which the central banks of the world, meaning these cartels of banks, they're real banks and they're cartels, just like a oil cartel or a banana cartel. They're cartels, and the process is to give them the legal power to create money out of nothing and then loan it into existence and collect interest on the loans. That's it. You don't need to go any further than that. And they've perfected this scheme, and they do create trillions of it now, and all of it goes into the economy through the banking system, every bit of it. And when it goes into the economy through that channel, it produces interest income to the banks. If you understand that, you understand what this is all about.
I would just like to add, if I might, that the idea that if you have $100 in your pocket and they have quantitative easing and they create another $1 trillion, your $100 just lost a lot of value because you have your same $100, but there's more dollars chasing after that product you want, and therefore the price of that has to go up. That's how they're stealing from you, because your dollar that you did own, that you worked for, now is worth much less because they put that into the system the way he just described.
Yes, and I thank you for saying that, Father, because that is the bottom line. You might say, well, so what? Aren't these guys clever? Why didn't I think of that? Well, and you say, well, who cares? So they do well, it doesn't affect me. It does affect you, as Father said, because the process of this expansion of the money supply is called inflation. And so your purchasing power of your dollars or whatever your monetary unit is just keeps going down and down and down every year. It's not that prices are going up, it's that the value of the money is going down. And so you start off earning $1, and you've given a lot of effort to earn that $1, but 10 years later, that $1 buys maybe 10 cents worth of goods that it could have bought in the year that you earned it. And so over a lifetime, at the present rate of inflation in the United States and in Canada, over a lifetime, over 70 years of working for your money and saving it and so forth, they will steal from you about 97% of the purchasing power of everything you've earned and saved. So that's a tax. It's a hidden tax, but it's a tax just the same, and it's one without exemptions and without deductions, and it hits the poor people harder than it does the rich people. And so, yes, as Father said, this is why we need to be concerned about it, because it's a means of transferring wealth from the middle class primarily to the politically favored class.
Well, and it's even worse than that, because what they do, it's not just inflation. What they do is they lend money that doesn't exist, that they made up, and then they charge you for it. And so you have to come up with new money to pay the charges. So that's what's fueling the continual inflation. But then it gets worse because they then can create boom and bust cycles. So they can create collapses. They can shrink the money supplies. There's not enough money to pay back all the loans that they issued. So what happens then? People default on their loans, and then the banks take real things. And money's not real. The money they create is fake. But people own real things, factories, tools, land. And so what does the bank do? Oh, we created a bust. You can't pay your loans. We'll take away all your real assets that are real productive assets, and they get then concentrated in the banks, and they make money. So it's even more than the inflation. It's that they create loans, then they also have the ability, through controlling the money supply, to create financial collapses. And that's exactly what happened in 2007, 2008, 2001. Go all the way back to 1929, 1907, create booms and busts, make people have loans, make it so they can't pay them back, at least a large portion of them, and at the end of the day, you walk away with more assets. And so they're not only taxing, they're taking away the real economic assets in the economy and concentrating them. That's why, and again, I thank Mr. Jasper for making so many people aware of this. We can't trust labels. Because what do people think? Oh, all these people on Wall Street and bankers, they're capitalists. They're against communism. Who staffed all the administrations of Obama, Clinton, George Bush, whoever they are? They're all from Wall Street. Who was there implementing Obamacare and socialized medicine and all these things? They were from Wall Street. But people think, oh, they're not communists. They're for capitalism, which they think means the opposite of communism. But they're all trying to get to the same end. They're just using different techniques to do it.
I actually have my own question regarding this, and I'll just give it to the panel at large, to Brian and Bill and Mr. Griffin and Father Gruner. And that is the present, because you're talking about boom and bust, the present problem of student loans and student debt. I maybe somewhere here said it this week, but I either heard it here or heard it elsewhere, that the amount that's owed in student loans, people trying to pay off their college, is greater than all the credit card combined. And would anybody want to address how this works in with this whole system that you're talking about?
Well, again, I'll tell you an interesting fact. I tell my law school class when I teach bankruptcy. You know what they did with student loans? They make all these loans, so they make a lot of money off of everybody, because then they say everybody's got to go get a degree. Now the degrees are more expensive, so you need more loans. And then they passed a law about 20, 30 years ago that if you go into bankruptcy, your debts can be discharged, except for student loans. They accept exception out. Now your student loans are with you forever. Until they're paid off, they're with you. Then in 2005, they passed something called the Bankruptcy Reform and Consumer Protection Act, which is another thing I tell my law students. Never judge a law by its title. In fact, if you want to judge it, it's the opposite of its title. It was really the Bankruptcy Corruption and Bank Protection Act, not Consumer Protection Act. Because what they did is they said, hey, this student loan gig is good. And now that people never get out of their student loans, let's add credit cards in. And so they made it credit card debt, which they're now making even more off of, is non-dischargeable in bankruptcy. So the whole system is geared towards making sure no one, or practically no one, can escape from the enforced servitude that this brings about. Again, we talk slavery and servitude. We're beyond that. We would never have slavery. Well, if your chain is a debt that you can never escape from, and you're working your entire life to pay off that debt, you can't see it as easily as a chain around your leg, but the result is the same.
And that tempts me to make a comment, and you're right on target there. Have you ever noticed that common criminals often get off quite easily? I mean, people can steal money from a company, they can commit robbery, murder, and they seem to get off so easily. But if they rob a bank, oh man, that's serious. Or if they cheat the government, oh, wait a minute. So you see, it's a way of examining who's really running the show. We're dealing with a partnership here between bankers and politicians. They are really the ruling clique, and you don't mess with them. See, that's the thing.
I'd like to just make a quick comment on that. First of all, Dr. Collins, is your book available?
I've actually only had a few copies. They're all gone here, but it's available either from the Remnant newspaper or Catholic University of America Press. You can get it from there.
Okay, and the title is?
It's The Church and the Usurers, Unprofitable Lending for the Modern Economy.
Okay, and Ed, your book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, is available, right?
Definitely.
Okay. Folks, if this is such a crucial issue to everything that we're talking about here in terms of freedom and morality and preserving our families, you know, the debt here, which is crushing our entire country and is really theft on such a huge scale. The encouraging thing about this is that since 2008, when we had the financial meltdown and started having all of these bailouts, speaking for myself, this is the first time in 40 years that I have seen a major breakthrough in public consciousness on this. When I first I was in college, I was graduating from college 40 years ago, and this really hit me as a very powerful thing. There weren't many books on the Federal Reserve at the time, and trying to figure it out was a really tough thing. And so I was so pleased when Ed came out with his book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. It is the first one that really explains how we got there. He explains it in very good story form. What actually happens, takes you through the steps. How do they monetize the debt? What is this magic mumbo jumbo that they use to get the congressman to go along with this and to get the public to go along with this? And how have they been able to bamboozle the public for so long? And that's when we had Ron Paul here last night or the night, 2 nights ago. That, again, this was a major breakthrough. I had been working with members of Congress for decades trying to get an audit of the Federal Reserve, to get his legislation to abolish the Federal Reserve. We could never get anywhere because people couldn't understand it, and as soon as you started talking about the Federal Reserve, people's eyes would glaze over. But since 2008, when they started all those bailouts, all of a sudden, Ed and the Fed and concern about the Fed finally has put that out there where people are saying, hey, this is really a critical issue. This is a financial nuclear attack on our families, on everything that we own. But in order to really advance on this, we have to understand what it is we're dealing with. And I think both of these books are very important for us to have that kind of knowledge. And so you can pay me my commission later.
Yeah, they will be too. They'll be available through the Fatima Crusader, www.fatima.org. What is the fatimashop.com, is it? Or .org, is it? I think it's Fatima Shop, and it's spelled the old-fashioned way, Fatima, SHOPPE.com. But I would like to, before I go on to the next question, I wanted to just situate all this talk about economics within the 6 points of Father Fahey, because people might be saying, well, this is a Catholic conference. What do you talk about economics? Because man is so fragmented today in his thinking that he thinks that economics is over here and family life is over here and religion is over here. But Father Fahey helps you see that it's all part of a structure of the divine program of our Lord for order in the world. And the 6 points are as follows. The first, that there is only one true church, the Catholic Church, outside of which there is no salvation, and that states and governments must recognize this as such. Point number 2 is the indirect power of the church over the state, that we don't have priests in Congress and priests in the Senate or anything like that. That's the duty of lay people. But if they're going to pass laws, they have to base their laws of right and wrong on what the gospel teaches is right and wrong, and on what the church teaches is right and wrong. The third point of the divine program for order is marriage, true Christian marriage. The fourth is the begetting and the education of children as members of Christ. as members of Christ, not just begetting children and turning them loose into the pagan world. The fifth is wide distribution of private property. And the sixth point is...
So that they can support their church.
Yeah, so they could support this, so that man will have the means to live, to have the material things you need to live a virtuous life. St. Thomas Aquinas talks about that we need a certain amount of, not big wealth, but a certain amount of wealth so that we can live a virtuous life. And then the sixth point is economics. And basically, what he says is that, I'll go it upside down, that finance should be at the service of the means of production of the industrial arts. So the economic arts should be at the service of the industrial arts, and the industrial arts should be at the service of Christ in happy families. But Father Fahey says today we have the reverse. We have man that is subject to production, and production that is subject to money. So that's just a quick overview of why economics is the type of thing we're talking about, is in fact a very Catholic issue.
I'm reminded of what I think Catherine Pearson said about Malachi Martin. Said at the end of all this process in our time, there are 60 to 80 families that rule the world because of this control of finance, which controls everything else, which controls the world. Whether that's exactly right, you get the idea. These banks that we're talking about, the Federal Reserve System, is not a United States bank, is not a United States agency, government agency. It's a private bank. And that all these things, and all the banks have to pay their dues to the Federal Reserve System. We're also paying to the IMF and these other international banks. They're all run by private bankers, and those are the 60 families or 80 families that are running the world. And they do that by paying their politicians to vote the way they want, and paying the schools to teach what they want, and paying the mass media to give what Mr. Borghezio said this morning, which was, I think Alex did a tremendous job actually hearing, writing down, and then translating, but he missed one thing, that this educator, this person working for the mass media said, the job of the mass media is not to inform, but to teach. And that included keeping back information from the general public that isn't part of the agenda that they want to give you. And that was what Mr. Borghezio's point was on that aspect. And so you see, of course, that's because if our first God, that's why you can't serve God and man. If our first goal is to get as much money as we can, then you can be underpaid. What is your price? Is it 100,000? Is it 200,000? Is it 50,000? Whatever it is. But if your first thing is to serve God, and yes, God knows you need money and everything else, but you serve God, and that comes first. But most people, I think today, think that their idea is that they have to get paid absolutely well, purposely, to their standard, or otherwise they'll get another job. No, do what God wants you to do first, and then we'll get what we need. A lot of us people don't realize that they're actually working for the devil when they're seeking the highest wages of people who are actually enslaving them as they go along.
Okay, at this point we're going to move into a little different area, and this is a question for Irving John Doak, and I think too Father Gruner can step into this as well. And it has to do with prophecy and the promise of peace, the period of peace. Is it so that after the period of peace, then things will go evil again and we will have the Antichrist? I know there's kind of two schools of thought in this. How do we look at this?
The peace, the era of peace that I was speaking about was based on the the same old problem, isn't it? The period of peace that I referred to in my talk this morning was based on one of the last chapters or maybe the last chapter of the book of the Apocalypse. And it speaks about a period in which Satan would be chained for 1,000 years. Now, the reason I talked about the apocalypse was because this was recommended by Sister Lucy. She said, if you want to uncover the third secret of Fatima, the 1960 secret, read the apocalypse. and the gospel. Now, I read it and basically focused on chapters 12 and 13, which speaks about the dragon, the woman, in other words, Satan and Mary, and the two beasts that serve Satan, the false prophet and the beast of the sea. Now, following from what we were saying up here this afternoon, what I was trying to argue was that the banking system, the monetary system we have today, which is evolving, which is a global system, which has taken over nations, annihilated nations, which is bringing in the mark of the beast, which is disrupting society, that system is being animated by the beast of the sea. That's what is contained in the apocalypse. Now, one further point is that, many people have talked about reforming the monetary system. They've done this for hundreds of years. How can we reform it? What's the Lady of Fatima got to do with the monetary system? Well, you see, if the monetary system is being animated by the beast of the sea, we've got to appreciate that in the apocalypse it also states that the beast of the sea is being served by the false prophet. And you know where the false prophet is? It's in the church. So how can we reform? We've got to clear up the problems in our church. I pointed out to you that the so-called Catholic Bibles that we're using these days are all mistranslated. They do not explain the role of Mary. How can you ever hope to consecrate the world to Mary when the church doesn't admit, through its Bibles at least, her role? They do not agree with the Lady of Guadalupe. She's the one who is clothed with the sun. She has the moon under her feet. And yet the theologians and philosophers that are speaking of these things say, no, it's not Mary at all. So my point is that you're never going to reform the monetary system. You can't defeat this. You can't control it because it's animated by an evil spirit. The only way you're going to defeat an evil spirit is to bring in a good spirit. And that good spirit is the spirit of Mary. Period.
The Blessed Virgin promises and predicts and promises that in the end her Immaculate Heart will triumph. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me. Russia will be converted and a period of peace given to mankind. People have asked why Russia, and I think that Dr. Walters, who's left, in his book, again, it's a book of fiction, however, his explanations are very theological and very accurate, I believe, that Russia is big enough, that it is strong enough, that it will resist worldly forces, including forces of evil spirits running the monetary system of the world. And that when Russia is converted, it won't just become better people living the commandments. That will happen, of course. But more than that, the nation itself together will convert. And as such, it will bring about the social order of Christ within the country of Russia. And the lies that the rest of the world has bought and believed because they've been propagandized by the mass media for the last 70 years and beyond will be seen. Russia will be a shining example just how they organize themselves, including the monetary system working properly at the service of the people, not becoming the people becoming their slaves. And yes, we talk about the slavery of the Civil War, the last century, but what is slavery? It is working for another. In the Middle Ages, the people had to work for their lord for the first 2 or 3 months, or that's how much time. They had half the year was holidays for them. Today, your tax day is sometime in May before you finish paying off the federal government. So you're working for, and not to mention all the other things that you're paying to them by indirect taxes. My point being that you are being enslaved by the taxation system, and what taxation I've been told, and I think Bill could perhaps tell me this better, or Ed here would be, is that you're not paying for the principal of what the government owes. You're only paying with your taxes the interest on the principal. And so you're paying for something you don't owe with your taxes, basically what's going on. They use other taxes to pay for things like either roads or military or whatever else. Now, I don't have all those details. What I'm getting at is that this will be overturned when Russia's... And the example and the missionary spirit of Russia, which has been chosen nation, once it is converted, all of us need conversion. Russia definitely needs conversion, but the rest of us need conversion too. That's in the message of Fatima. When Lucy is praying for the conversion of Russia, Spain, Portugal, Europe, and the world, our Lord congratulates her for that prayer and says, ask it also of my mother, and dictates 2 prayers. But then the plan of God to win this battle, it will be through the testimony and the power of the Blessed Virgin, but it's in an ordered way. Russia first. But Russia can't do it until it's consecrated. And the Pope can't do it until we pray enough for the Pope, because the Pope hasn't got the grace by himself. That's why we need to pray so much for the Pope. So God's glory and God's power will be seen in every step of the way. And it will be so dramatic that the whole world will see it once Russia's consecrated and converted. And that's why people might think, well, you know, it all sounds so simple, or Russia's changed, or communism has fallen. This is all lies against the message of Fatima, all lies that it hasn't fallen, as Bill has pointed out to us earlier, and the errors of Russia, as Ed has pointed out, we're living them even more than before. And we, of course, they're not called errors of Russia, they're not called communism, but we're still living them in this collectivization errors that we've listed off there. And so, but this, as far as the 2 timetables, is this. Does the Antichrist come first, and then we have the period of peace? Or does we have the period of peace, then the Antichrist comes afterwards? And there are 2 schools of thought on that, and I don't pretend to know the answer. I do know that the prophecy of Fatima promises that we will have the consecration of Russia. But the question for me is much more immediate, is will it be with us being even more enslaved than we are now? Will it be with us being annihilated? Because we do know that Russia will not be annihilated. We do know that Portugal will not be annihilated. They're both mentioned in the future of mankind. But now every other nation has not got that guarantee that they won't be annihilated. I think Spain from another prophecy has that guarantee. My point being, and apparently Ireland has it from St. Patrick, a prophecy of that. But many nations are on the hit list, and certainly the United States, not because they're worse, but because that's where they're Russian targets first of all. And that's where they see their danger coming from first of all. If they're going to rule the world, then the United States has to be put in its place. And of course, we have this Mikhail Ogarkov, I've forgotten his name now. He had his plan B, which called for the unprovoked, sudden destruction of the United States, and he estimated that in 30 minutes, 135 million out of 300 million Americans would be killed by nuking them with an unprovoked attack. That's the kind of thinking that it is diabolical, the forces we're against. And we have the prophecies. And every time the popes go to Fatima, they talk about chapter 12, verse 1 of the Apocalypse, which is, I saw a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. And opposing her is the great beast. And this great beast is often, it's conceived of as Russian communism, but behind Russian communism is Masonry, which communism is a child of. And as Pope Leo XIII points out, that Masonry and communism at their high ends are in agreement with each other. It's not for nothing that it was American gold coming from East Side New York, which was transferred, and you can read this in Father Fay's book, The Rules of Russia Today. The Canadian Navy, the most remarkable thing they did was to capture this ship with 25 million in gold, which would be worth billions today. If you take the price of gold at that time at $20, and it was 25 million, and multiply that by, divide 20 into the current price of about $1,300, you get an idea of the multiplier effect of what it was really. That's what went to pay for the revolution in Russia. It was the English crown, it was Colonel House that forced the Canadian government to let them go. They shouldn't have let them go. It was the Germans that sent in Lenin, and it was the nations of the world that sinned against Russia to bring about the Communist Revolution. But the sin was committed in Russia, in a sense it was forming a revolution not only against man, but against God above all. And so that needs to be reconsecrated, just as a desecrated cathedral needs to be reconsecrated. And so God has been has been sinned against in such a public way that God calls for and demands this public act of reparation. Not because the Russians are worse than anybody else, because that's where the sin was, and because Russia has been chosen as an instrument to bring about the evangelization of the world. It will happen, I don't say in our time, we may all be blown up before that happens, but it will happen in the normal lifetime of a number of people here, and it will happen after, if the bad example of us not paying attention, not doing what we could, is not, the people who survive will recognize we better consecrate Russia before it gets worse, and they'll finally get it done. And we do know Our Lady will have her victory in a short time, but the trial is whether we get it before the annihilation of nations and the enslavement of the rest of the world or not. That's the only question before us.
Here's a question that can go to the panel at large. What is the difference between collectivism and the common good?
I'll have a stab at that one. Collectivism is the opposite of the common good, even though that's part of the slogan. They say the greater good for the greater number. But we find out, if you follow the rational arguments all the way through, that the greater good for the greater number is to preserve the rights of the individual. That's what the greater good of the greater number is, because the individual, as I said before, is the only thing that's real. So if you say the common good, and you're referring, when you use that phrase, you're thinking of the group, and that's what most people do, then there's no difference between collectivism and the common good. It's a hollow concept. It's a myth. It's the result is always the opposite of what you think. But if you recognize that the more people have more people benefit under a system of individualism than under a system of collectivism, then in all honesty you can say that individualism is the greater good for the greater number.
I could.
I think so.
Go ahead. You want to do it? You want to say something?
Okay. Well, again, I think to take your advice, John, if we go to St. Thomas, he can really help us a lot here to make the distinction. The common good, and it's often helpful to understand a positive by looking at its negative. The opposite of the common good is the private good or the individual good. And the role of civil authorities and government is to pursue the common good, that good which is common to all of the components, the members of civil society, as opposed to the particular individual good of someone. And I guess one of the examples that Mr. Griffin gave in his talk is helpful. What's wrong with our governments today? They pass all these laws where they get all these bribes, and they don't call them bribes, they call them, we'll give you a campaign, but to pursue personal, individual, private goods. So your company, your bank needs a break, you need a bailout, so we'll pass a law to help you. That's not helping the common good, the good of all of us. It's helping this private good. St. Thomas gives the example, a king, a tyrant who passes a law to raise taxes to enrich himself is not serving the common good, he's serving his private good. The common good, we know, is there are two levels of it. There's a supernatural and a natural level component the church has always taught. The natural level is our pursuit of our temporal existence on earth, pursuit of virtue. Supernatural is to arrive at salvation and to see God face to face. They are goods that are common to all people, all individuals. They're the ends for which we were created. And when we pursue a goal that serves that end for everyone, for the entire society, that's the common good. Collectivism, and again, and here, building on St. Thomas, the popes, the great popes, Leo XIII, Pius X, Pius XI have explained this clearly. The root of modern collectivism, socialism, communism, which are all the same, Nazism, the same, is it's not oriented to the common good of man. Again, the two natural and supernatural aspects. It's oriented to a materialism, which is important because that's all the popes equate them. Communism, Nazism, socialism, collectivism, and materialism. They're all towards the private enrichment of some few. It's always some few. I forget who it was. Maybe it was Mr. Jasper. There's always a leader. I forget who that was. There's always this leader. It's always the person who's going to get rich out of it. The dictator of the proletariat, the National Socialist Party. And so collectivism is ordered towards taking the collective goods of the community and diverting them towards somebody's private benefit. as opposed to using our common resources to help advance the common good that God created in us. And it's a perversion of the end, and sees the end of man. Let me get rich. How can I take away from the community and divert it and sell it off to the highest bidder? Is the opposite. And that's what collectivism in all its forms is aimed towards doing, as opposed to promoting the common good of man.
I've been...
And just let me add one little annotation to that. He's absolutely right, but don't forget, when the oligarchy siphons off all of the cream, they always do it in the name of the common good. That's an important part of the scam. They've got to convince the people that they should be happy because it's for their good. That's the rest of that.
Well, they're just lying to...
They're just lying, yeah.
It's just a lie, exactly.
I've been privileged to study philosophy with Thomistic philosopher Dr. Raphael Waters, and he has a pretty developed teaching and understanding of the common good that comes through Father Woodbury and ultimately through Garrigou-Lagrange and St. Thomas. And one of the things he points out, just so we have an idea of what we're talking about here, is that the common good, he says, is always immaterial goods: peace, civic friendship, order, a well-informed public opinion. Things like this is what constitutes the common good. Oftentimes, common good is referred to as common goods or public goods, such as parks and roads and the police and the justice system. But he would differentiate that the material things are the public goods, but the common good are immaterial. And it shows too the disservice to the common good when we think that part of the common good is a well-informed public opinion. Today we have the schools, the high schools, the universities bending to this leftist ideology. You have the news media bending people to this leftist ideology. It's like what Mr. Bergoglio said, there were things that they purposely will not tell you for the sake of their own agenda. So we do not even have a well-informed public opinion. We have a lot of propaganda and a lot of false information out there, but what we have is a school system and the education system, the media and government that is working directly against the common good.
If I may add one thing to that. The confusion in this area, like so many others, is intentional. It has been cultivated intentionally. If those of you who use a computer, go on there and Google or Yahoo common good, you will find, first of all, pop up innumerable examples just almost every day from politicians and commentators on TV referring to Obamacare as for the common good, or when George Bush was pushing No Child Left Behind, it's for the common good. This program constitutes a common good. And so your points that you're making here is very important, John. It's the same thing that is similar, and maybe there's a distinction here, but it's very similar to what the Founding Fathers refer to in the Constitution and the writings as the general welfare, or they refer to the common welfare, or similar terms, in that it's an immaterial thing in which if we behave properly and we have a proper order, it will be conducive to a common good which will allow us all to excel in all of those areas of our lives.
Classically, the term res publica, which is translated into English to republic, is the common good. St. Thomas, by the way, defined, and I like the distinction, of course, that Dr. McCall made about there's two common goods. I mean, it's all the same ultimately, but one is the supernatural common good, which we're all born, whether we recognize it or not, whether we realize it or not. God created us in order to know, love, and serve Him in this world, to be happy with Him in the next. And we have to, therefore, it's not just us individually that have to do this, but the social order, the social goodness. We should be repressing pornography. We should not be allowing blasphemy, as I think that was made the point yesterday by Christopher Arrow, if I recall. We should not be allowing public blasphemy against God or against our Lord Jesus Christ, and that is part of the common good for the salvation of souls. And that is the highest common good. And of course, there's still the common good, which is having a well-informed, even for proper governance. You can't have proper governance if people don't know what's going on. You can't have proper governance if you can't even discuss things. You can't have proper governance if you open your mouth and someone doesn't like you. They call you, you're anti-so-and-so, and therefore we won't talk about it. That's not helping the common good. It doesn't help the public debate or discussion in a rational way in order to get to know what's the best thing for everyone in the society. We need to understand, but there are two levels. There's the supernatural and the natural. But even on the natural level, St. Thomas points out that all law, to be law, has to be oriented towards the common good. If it's not towards the common good, it's not law. That's right. It has to be rational. If it's not rational, it's not law. People have the idea that law is what the legislators say it is. Without it being for the common good, it cannot be law. Without it being rational, it cannot be law. So a lot of these laws that they pass, these 90,000 or 160,000 laws, and when they're made for particular goods, they're not law. And so you don't have to have a problem of conscience. Well, that's what the law says. No, the law is for the common good. If it's not for the common good, I don't care. 100% of Congress, 100% of every legislator voted for it. If it's not for the common good, it cannot be law by definition. God did not give authority to legislators to make laws, so-called laws, which are against the common good. They don't have that authority. That's why abortion laws are really, they're called laws, but they're not laws at all. And the idea, once you have the clear understanding of what law is, St. Thomas has 16 questions in his Summa Theologica, very clear, very easy to follow. Almost, I think everyone here could just read it slowly, you'll get it all. But there's his definition. Law is the ordination of reason given by one who has charge of the community, which is promulgated for the common good. 4 conditions, one of those missing, is not law.
And in fact, he calls the thing that doesn't meet that's not a law, an act of violence, which is what most of our laws are. But there's really an important point that I think people need to take away from this discussion. It's very, very important because it's a danger that a lot of us can fall into, and there are things which are created by God for goods, and they're meant to be good. And law, for example, is one of them. The common good is one of them. But what's happened, and this came out in this discussion, is those goods have been perverted, and not that the good itself has, but they've been used for perverted purposes by evil people. And so law, as we see it today on most statute books, is not really law. It's violence, but it looks like law. What is purported to be the common good and talked about as the common good is not really the common good. And the danger we have to be careful of is drawing a distinction. The misuse of these goods is bad and needs to be stopped. But what we don't want to do is fall into where we deny the goods themselves. It's a real danger, and we can see it in the church, because Catholics in our time are very susceptible to this. Authority, for example, in the church has been very misused for the past 40 years, has been used to push error, to destroy the liturgy. And so what do some people, seeing the problem, do? They react the wrong way and they say, the problem is authority. We shouldn't have any authorities. There should just be priests off on their own doing their own thing, and we don't want, because authority is bad. No, what's bad is the perversion of that, the misuse of it for the past 40 or 50 years. And what we have to be very careful about is to not reject the things that God created as goods and that are meant to be good and to help us, because people have, in modern times, distorted them. We have to be careful about the distinction. Otherwise, we end up throwing out, as Sedevacantists do, as some who tried to break up the traditionalist movement, for example, by rejecting superiors and authority, have done. And we have to always be wary of not letting our rightful recognition of the problems that have happened and the horrors that have happened, throwing away the true goods that God has there.
This is one of my hot-button topics, so I can't let it alone. If you remember from my presentation, I suggested that the proper function of the state was negative, to defend the life, liberty, and property of citizens. If that were the basis of our state, the basis of society, and if all laws had to pass that test, then all of this discussion would be not necessary. It would be hard for me to even imagine a law that had as its purpose the defense of life, liberty, and property. It's hard to imagine anything that wouldn't be in accordance with God's will, because that is the right that we all have as individuals, to defend our lives, liberty, and property. And therefore we can delegate the authority to our state. We can delegate it because we have it, but we don't have the right to tell our neighbor what to do. We don't have the right to, provide for one at the expense of the other. We don't have it. So therefore, how can we delegate that authority to the state? It is only once we get beyond this litmus paper test of what is the proper function of law, that's only when we start getting into these really imponderable problems. So we get back to the need to have some kind of a rule of thumb, some kind of a checklist. And I honestly believe, after thinking about this for so long, that if we just stuck to the rule, the purpose of the law, the purpose of the state is negative, to defend against life, liberty, and property, most of these issues would be solved without our even having to think about them.
I agree, most of them would be solved. I do think that the more complete understanding of authority, as Brian pointed out, is all authority comes from God. And so we, as my professor was trying to tell me that St. Paul was discriminating against women, I had to point out to him that you owe obedience to your religious superior as I owe it to my bishop or to the prime minister in the things that God has given him authority to do. Now, there's an overblown view of authority, both in the church and the state, that if I say so, it's got to be because I'm the boss. That's not God's view of authority. And yes, the whole principle of subsidiarity, which I'm sure John could expand upon as well as others, that God does not give authority to the mayor to tell you, you must put your garbage can in that corner of your house, and you must put your kitchen over here, and your bedroom cannot be on the second floor. No, the owner of the house decides that. And so all authority is measured so that what can be done at the local level is done at the local level. And that's before you even get to the mayor, you get to your own house, or you get to your, and as men understand quickly, I'm not married, of course, but you leave your wife to take care of the kitchen. Don't try and tell her how to run it. So it's all the way through society. The same thing. What is done at the county level or what's done at the state level is only those things that are too big or would touch on too many other people. So that, but all authority comes from God, and God does not give authority to any authority, whether it be in the church or the state, to go beyond the jurisdiction God has given. And we can know what that authority is. It's in Scripture, it's in the magisterial teaching. Even the Pope's authority has more authority than any other man on the face of the earth. Even his authority is restricted by God. And we need to know what that authority is and the extent of it. And that's what, and then we have, but if people go around thinking that authority comes from the will of the people, which is collectivism, then, or we give it that authority to do that. No, we can't give authority that God doesn't give. So I think but this is most likely too much for today, but I don't want to, but go ahead if you want to.
Why do we have time? Well, I guess I have to disagree a little bit, not with Father, but it is very dangerous. And in fact, I think we've all seen this session this afternoon, very important. The use of myths to trick us into things. And the idea that authority comes from people, that comes from the people, is one of those myths, going back hundreds of years, been used to prop up totalitarianism. The only sure guide against it is exactly what Father was saying. Authority does not come from the people. Because whenever you say authority comes from the people, did you get into a room? Did you sign a social contract? Did you limit that authority? No, you didn't. It's always a myth. It's what the totalitarian ruler says was the will of the people. What Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, it's the general will. It's whatever, but who determines it? Well, I'm in charge, so I'll tell you. So the power of the authority to govern and to make law does not come from the people, because whenever it comes from the people, then you can do whatever you want in the name of the people, because you can never verify what was given. The only source of authority, when it comes from God, is the only way to limit authority, because God legislated this universe. An old medieval saying is God is a God of law. He created a law through the universe which defined and placed within proper bounds the rule of thumb that Father quoted so perfectly from St. Thomas on what law is. And he said, I'm going to establish there to be authorities in the church and in civil society to bring about the perfection of my law, but I'm only giving them a limited authority to do so. And anything they do outside the scope of that is a violence, is not a making of law. And that's the rule of thumb. But the philosophical principle is important because it has to be traced back to God. And when it was traced back to God, there were limits on authority. There were. The French Revolution shows us any authority before that who rest on that principle, authority comes from God, would have never dreamed of the abuse of power exercised in the French Revolution in the name of the people who had appointed them.
Gentlemen, thank you. We've run out of time. This is the type of discussion that could go on until midnight, I think. And, but we only have a certain amount of time in our videotapes. So being that the case, too, I know we acknowledge the staff of the Fatima Center who are all out here.
I have come to warn the faithful to amend their lives and ask pardon for their sins. They must not continue to offend our Lord, who is already deeply offended. In the final vision on October 13, 1917, Our Lady silently held out the scapular, a gesture which indicates that she wants everyone to wear it. Our Lady said, "If my requests are not heeded, Russia will spread her errors throughout the world, raising up wars and persecutions against the Church. The good will be martyred. The Holy Father will have much to suffer, and various nations will be annihilated." Pray a great deal and make sacrifices for sinners, for many souls go to hell because they have no one to make sacrifices and pray for them.
Our Lady makes miracles happen all the time, and the Pope, I think if it's up to Our Lady, he's going to view this DVD and see what we have to say and see the trouble we're in. Governments, social societies, and sadly even many parish priests and diocesan bishops, even some Vatican officials are not responding seriously and properly to these diabolical threats to our lives and souls that we face today. Holy Father, your flock is desperate, vulnerable, and confused amidst the catastrophic dangers their lives and souls are in. We are deeply concerned for the future of our children, and most important, for the welfare of their souls. The whole world is despondent and unified in one anguished cry. What hope have we? Holy Father, you hold that hope. That solution is in the palm of your hand. Only you can save your flock and the world. And that is by obedience to the holy request of the Mother of God herself, Our Lady of Fatima, who said of herself, "Only I can help you." All she asks is for you, Holy Father, together with all the Catholic bishops of the world, at the same time to consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. A mere 5-minute prayer. Holy Father, you need not worry about any repercussions or threats that we all hear about today are being hurled at him. Have confidence, Holy Father. Have confidence in Our Lady's promise. Heaven does not make mistakes. God created the miracle of the Son and fulfilled prophecies made at Fatima for you, Holy Father, so you would believe and do as Our Lady of Fatima requests. Trust in the loving guidance that Our Lady of Fatima gives you. Trust in her maternal promise of protection, as you yourself have nurtured your flock to do. Our Lady requested the consecration of Russia, not the world. She was specific, and Our Lady does not mince words. Please, Holy Father, take Our Lady's words seriously and literally. We cannot change a formula prepared in heaven by God himself, which he sent you through his Holy Mother. Holy Father, when you baptize a baby called John Paul, you don't say, I baptize all the babies in the world. It would not be valid. Holy Father, when you consecrate a new church, Our Lady of Fatima Church, you don't just say, I consecrate the churches in the world. It would not be valid. Without mentioning John Paul by name, you would not have effected that baptismal consecration. You would not have set aside that specific baby, John Paul, for God. Without mentioning Our Lady of Fatima Cathedral by name, you would not have effected that consecration. You would not have set aside that specific cathedral for God. Neither, and I must emphasize this, neither can you effect the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary if you do not mention Russia by name. Consecrating all the countries in the world, again, does not set aside Russia for God. The consecration would be invalid, and it does not and it will not have the promised effect. Holy Father, you better than I know this. You are our shepherd. We look to you for guidance and protection against the diabolical forces that prey after our souls on a daily basis. And so we are confused as to why you have not done the consecration of Russia according to the formula Our Lady requested and which God himself commanded. Holy Father, time has run out. Our Lady offered us the only solution, but only through you. Every day of delay in making this consecration, many, many more souls and lives are lost. Today, even thousands upon thousands of souls are already being persecuted, tortured, imprisoned, murdered for their faith. Please do not delay any longer. Please protect your flock. Please consecrate Russia now before it is too late for us, and even for yourself, as the vision of the third secret foretells. Holy Father, we pray for you daily. Save us, save our children. Save yourself from the horrible chastisements prophesied by Jesus and Mary if you do not hasten to fulfill Our Lady of Fatima's request now. Holy Father, now is the time to show Our Lady of Fatima your trust in her and your obedience to her command.
Our Lady said to Sister Lucia of Fatima, I promise to assist at the hour of death with all the graces necessary for salvation. All those who on the first Saturday of 5 consecutive months go to confession, receive Holy Communion, recite 5 decades of the Rosary, and keep me company for 15 minutes while meditating on the mysteries of the Rosary, with the intention of making reparation to me. Pray the Rosary every day to obtain peace for the world. Pray a great deal and make sacrifices for sinners, for many souls go to hell because they have no one to make sacrifices and pray for them.
Our Lord said to Sister Lucia of Fatima, "The sacrifice that each one can make is to do his duty and obey my law. That is the form of penance I now demand.